Yo, what's good? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be doing a tier list, with an actual tier list included, of all of the new updated versions of the Exalted Weapons, and this includes all of what would you previously call, pseudo-exalted, so all of Khora, Atlas, Gara and Ash's Exalted Weapons, and all of the other ones now able to use arcanes, because I think all of these have either gotten better or worse, pretty much all of them better, let's be honest. And I wanted to do an updated tier list on where I think these stand. Remember, this is all my personal opinion. You guys are obviously going to have your own in the comments, and that's completely fine. But also I think there's some things we need to go over that are going to affect my rankings before we get stuck in. For example, rankings could be lowered depending on how reliant an Exalted Weapon is on, let's say, a helmet ability. The weapon isn't particularly great outside of a particular helmet combo, then it can lower its rank. And of course augments as well. I think relying on a band-aid augment is really bad design. I think abilities should be designed in a way that is accessible to all players, including ones that maybe don't have access to every augment in the game. And that also ties in with build versatility. And of course overall, the reason for a particular weapon being at the top tier would usually be due to the combination of very high damage and efficiency. Efficiency of course really just means speed or overall DPS, how easily and efficient you can kill large amounts of enemies with these weapons, and of course single target damage isn't as useful overall. Okay, let's get stuck in, and first we're going to tackle the 4 previously pseudo-exalted Warframes, because these are the most important ones to speak of right now. Starting with Ash's Bladestorm. Bladestorm is so much better than what it used to be, and honestly previously I think most people would have seen this as not even really being a pseudo. The biggest update that this got was overall I think its DPS. It was always good at doing a large amount of damage at once, big hits of slash damage, and it's still capable of doing that, but it's now not only doing way more damage overall due to certain helmet options actually working with its exalted modding system, but I think the speed in which this thing kills is faster, but at the same time is its primary issue, which prevents it from getting into something like S tier. Bladestorm is great with and without helmets. It also doesn't need any augments to be particularly good. With a very high combo count, you can pull off millions of slash procs at once. However, even though it's faster now and much better at doing missions such as survivals, it's still not very good in a multiplayer setting because other abilities in the game can just kill faster, and that's because it requires you to look around and scan enemies with it first. It's faster than it was, but still not fast enough to keep up with a lot of other DPS frames in the game, but the overall damage it does do is way higher. Combining this with something like Raw or Raffle Advance makes it one of the most single powerful abilities in the game. Not many things can really stand a hit from Bladestorm now. I think the overall damage this thing has to offer is more than enough to get it into A tier, and that's where I'll be leaving it. Next up, we got to talk about Atlas. Although he did lose out on a little bit of his overall damage, the amount of big crit numbers he used to be able to get with certain Rivens was super fun, but he now has access to way more range because you can spread the damage not only from increasing barrel range but also using prime reach, and then combining it all with influence. Atlas's overall damage is still incredible, but now he can apply it to a much larger area at once, and it's just way more accessible to newer players. He keeps his simplicity, and he is just much improved on, albeit his overall one-hit potential may be slightly reduced. Most of you guys know how I feel about Atlas right now because of the recent video we did on him. I think he is an incredible spot, and Landslide is easily one of the best Exalteds. In my honest opinion, I'd put Atlas in S tier. I just think Landslide is way too efficient and hits way too hard all at once for it to not be anything other than the top of the pack. Sure, a few Exalted Weapons could overall deal way higher damage numbers, Ash included, but I don't know man, Landslide is just way too efficient and I have to throw it in S tier. Next up we have to talk about Gara's Shattered Lash. I think this ability feels the most different with the recent changes. Before, the best setup was to combine her 4 with her 2 and its augments to boost the overall damage of her Shattered Lash because you could spread the debuff from her 2. This was cool, even though I absolutely can't stand the playstyle of having to mash her 4 to keep the duration up of a damage reduction, but now you can literally just run around and spam her Shattered Lash. Of course I love combining it with Raffle Advance just like most of these builds, but it once again isn't necessary. There's a number of helmets that work, you don't even really need them, the damage is going to be very strong, it has a huge range. To me this feels just as efficient as Atlas's Landslide, also really doesn't require any augments to make work, and synergizes really nicely with Gara's kit overall, so it's always got a good place in her playstyle. For me this is an easy S tier once again. Now moving on to Khora's Whipclaw. Now admittedly I've always felt Khora's Whipclaw feels a bit weird in certain tile sets and depending on how many enemies are funneling in at once. In missions where there is incredible enemy density, I think Khora is easily moving up to A, maybe even S tier, But overall, Khora's single target damage is arguably worse now, but her group damage and being able to quadratically scale melee influence in groups makes her ensnare combination even more brutal than it was before. But to me, she just feels a little bit inconsistent. Like, even when you build her for her capped out range, which I believe can be achieved with overextended and cunning drift if I'm not mistaken, and then you get her on prime reach, it still feels like she's outranged and out consistently struck by someone like Gara and Atlas. I just think the hitbox is weird on Khora, and it always has been. Of course, you can lock down areas with her 4, and it's way more efficient that way. Don't get me wrong, I think she's great, and I do believe there's players that are overreacting to the fact that her overall damage could be a bit lower due to the lack of ribbons available. In my opinion, Whipclaw is still extremely powerful, and it's only slightly worse at single target damage, but it's better at group damage. I might get a bit of flack for this. I actually think it's B tier, and you know what, I have no problem with the comment section getting a bit spicy about this take, because I'm aware it could very well be A tier. I just think that others so far above feel better to use in game. Now we're moving on to the Exalted, which have pretty much only changed in the fact that they can use arcanes, starting with Mesa's Peacemaker. Mesa was already one of the best Exalteds in the game, but Peacemaker now has access to not only stuff like secondary Innovate, Dexterity, Merciless. It can't really use Deadhead because it doesn't get headshots, but one of the criticisms that Mesa really has amongst any players, if you can really find one, is that she's not the greatest for level cap, because she's a damage reduction based Warframe. But now at a high level you can get away a bit more by using secondary Fortify for overguard on Peacemaker. You could arguably go for more damage, but Fortify is just going to make you unkillable when there's a lot of Xmas around. This was already S tier before this update, and I think it remains at the same spot. Now moving on to Baruuk's Fists, and I can't lie, I think this one is now moving up a bit as well. Previously maybe I would have said A tier, but with melee influence in the equation now and just arcanes in general, this thing is such a problem. But it's not only the arcane changes that are huge. Being able to use Weeping Wounds and Blood Rush on this weapon is a game changer. Previously, this ability used to really only be useful with its augment, because you could pump it for the status chance and then it would adapt via elements depending on the enemy it was hitting. But now you can literally remove this augment mod and still get away with an incredible amount of damage if you're modding the ability correctly. This means it's way more versatile to use overall, and of course this thing is great with and without augments. This thing will clear rooms in an instant, it's very easy to build, and for me it's just a perfect S tier. Now the next one may also get a bit controversial because some people might think I'm overrating the hell out of this thing, and that's Valkyr's Claws. Valkyr's Claws were already so insane, just carrying her entire kit. Not only do you have access to some of the best crit stats in the game and overall DPS, this ability makes you completely invulnerable. Even before this update, I would have said Valkyr's Talons were very underrated, but now, with the access to melee influence, Blood Rush, Weeping Wounds, and Maiming Strike, even the slide attack setups have become even more powerful. It takes a very high level enemy to really survive this thing now, and the only criticism you can really give it is that it lacks a bit of range, but I honestly think that is completely irrelevant. Due to the speed in which you can hit enemies and how much mobility you have in slide attacks, this is extremely comparable to Wukong's Staff, which we haven't even gone onto yet. For me, this is going in the S tier. Moving on, we have Excalibur's Exalted Blade. You all know how incredible this thing is with influence right now, and I think one of the biggest and best changes was the changes to the heavy attacks. Being able to send out that massive wave and make use of Tennokai is a really big boon to its damage. The single target is also really good on this thing, but admittedly it will get outclassed by the big one hits of something like Valkyr's Talons, but the overall group DPS you can get out of Exalted Blade is still incredible. And in addition, you also don't need augments for this thing. Once again, the ability is really good without Chromatic Blade now, much like Baruuk's Fists, meaning that it's way easier to mod for. By proxy of being on a Warframe like Excalibur, it makes it not as good because Excal is lacking a bit in survivability, at least for higher level content, and I personally feel like it's a bit more consistent at applying its damage compared to someone like Khora. I do think Baruuk and Valkyr's Talons have a bit of an edge on this thing right now, but it's not by too much. I'm throwing this in the A tier alongside Ashe. Now moving on to my personal favourite, being Wukong's Iron Staff. Iron Staff is in a very similar spot to Valkyr's Talons. This has become way stronger, mainly due to Weeping Wounds and Blood Rush now being available. You don't even need Influence on it because it already has incredible range potential, but throwing Influence in the mix is just broken. This has extremely quick slide attacks, much like Valkyr's Talons. Building this thing for range, influence and slides is really fun, albeit it's going to make your hand ache. Overall, it will do less single target damage compared to Valkyr's Talons, but the overall range in which you are hitting enemies is far more. So if you're looking for a rangier version of an Exalted weapon, you go with Wukong's stick. If you're looking for higher damage, shorter range, you go with the Talons. And not to mention, this thing can easily decimate groups of enemies at once using Blast. A lot of the combinations in the stance of Primal Fury are incredibly effective at proccing Blast because they're multi-hits. There's a lot of ways to build this thing, it's incredibly versatile, definitely full force back in the meta. I have to throw it in S tier. Moving on to Ivara's Artemis bow. Admittedly, it did get better. I think the best thing you can do with this is probably throw on Deadhead. Talking about Artemis bow is kind of difficult because I think there's definitely a place for using it with and without concentrated arrow. Also, with either version of this ability, you don't actually have to hold it down to charge it up. Still feels like shit though, and it's incredibly slow. The damage it has access to now is much better than it was before, don't get me wrong. However, it's still pretty inefficient and clunky to use. I know Ivara mains love Artemis bow and constantly talk about the incredible levels of damage you can get with a huge explosion. Oh, I'm hitting 20 mil plus per shot. But doesn't this thing have like damage fall off on its explosions? I swear the guys on the outer rim of the explosion don't take anywhere near as much damage as the guy who you hit with the headshot, requiring you to line up a headshot and also sit on a zipline with the augment for bonus crit damage. I don't think it's a bad ability, I just don't think it's overall particularly mind-blowing for an Exalted weapon, and I just think the overall efficiency of the ability and how much setup and bonus buffs it requires to make it anything close to top tier is way too much of an ask. Like I said, I don't think it's a bad ability, but goddamn do people love to cope about this thing being a fucking god killer, and everything else we've covered so far would completely out DPS it, and that's just a fact. And for that reason, I have to throw it in the C tier. It's a great weapon, competing with a lot of other great weapons, and that's just the unfortunate reality of its existence. Now we've got to move on to Sevagoth's Shadow Claws. These are in a very weird spot, and it's less to do with the overall DPS they have, and more to do with his kit design. As for the claws themselves, they are unbelievable in terms of the DPS they have available. To be honest, I can't really tell too much of a damage difference, because before you would just pull enemies in, debuff them with your 3, and then melt them with like viral heat on your claws. Now you can do it, but with viral melee influence, which is even more busted, and these are without a doubt one of the hardest hitting Exalted weapons in the game that could put them in S tier on damage alone, but they're on Sevagoth. Not only does Sevagoth Shadow require a charge up of you using your 1 combined with your 2 to even activate this skill, which guaranteed is very easy, but the problem is the combination of his 1 and 2 and subsuming off his ult with his 4 is such a broken combination to begin with that can one-shot anything in the game. It makes using Exalted weapon kind of redundant. Building Sevagoth mainly for his shadows to send out and just kill everything instantly is so efficient that having a strong Exalted weapon on him loses its overall value. In terms of the weapon itself, it's easily S tier, but the combination of the Exalted Shadow's clunky mobility and lack of usage in the grand scheme of the game does take it down a notch. Do I think the claws are overall more incredible than something like Khora's whip? It's very hard to say. Khora's whip has much wider range of DPS and access to a whole room of damage when hitting her 4, but then Shadow has the grouping tool and the debuff and overall way bigger numbers. Although it's close, I do believe Sevagoth's shadows are in A tier. Maybe I'm overrating them a little bit, but to me the damage doesn't lie. Now moving on to Hildryn's Balefire charger, which I'll be honest is my least favourite one of the game, but I'm not going to let that stop me from giving it a honest rating at least. Balefire charger's weird. It is better now. The charger got an augment recently that allows you to do 15% of Hildryn's overall shield damage as bonus damage upon ult firing. The ult fire is like a quick burst, and admittedly the damage is incredible. This thing is way more powerful than it once was, and the arcanes only improve that further. However, I still can't help but feel this ability is a little bit clunky, albeit very powerful. There's not really too much to say about this skill. It's literally just a wrist rocket launcher, and it does rely on an augment to make it as good as it possibly could be. It is better without its augment now. However, I can't really see a reason to ever not run it with said augment, which is a problem in its design. I mean, seriously, an entire ult fire of burst damage that you pretty much would only ever use. Scrap the regular fire completely because of it. That is just a band-aid augment. For me, I gotta put this one in the B tier. Next up we have Titania's 2 Exalted abilities, Dex Pixia and Diwata. The Dex Pixia being her dual pistols, and whilst yes they are way more powerful with the inclusions of arcanes, they still have one huge glaring issue, and that is the fact they have a magazine capacity and a slow recharge reload. If you want to make the most of these, you have to figure out a way to give them ammo efficiency either via an arcane or subsume. There's already a hit to its overall rank because it requires one of those things. I do not understand why Dex Pixia has a magazine. We have peacemakers in the game, they have infinite ammo and aimbot at the same time. Remove the mag from this thing, let it fire infinitely, and it would probably be in A or maybe even S tier. However, the overall DPS this thing has to offer is strong enough to, in my opinion, land it in B tier. And then we have to talk about her melee Diwata, which I think is a little bit slept on, but overall, in order to make it really strong, it requires too much at the same time. An augment to increase its attack speed definitely really wants a helmet such as Raffle Advance, and you gotta pump it full of mods and have to use melee influence with it. I think it's fun as shit and can easily wipe rooms with that setup. That's just too much to ask at the same time, and not even Artemis bow requires that much to make it good. I do love the Diwata, but admittedly, as we've already established, the way I rank these weapons is based on how much they require to be good. The helmet and augments is notching this thing down a lot. Still recommend you try though. Next up we have Dante's Exalted Book, which I think is a bit tricky to rank. Very good base damage, lot slash, incredible ult fire as well. Synergizes perfectly with his kit. However, it can be out DPS'd pretty much by everything so far in A and S tier. However, it also has access to all of the tome mods, and you can place multiple on it at the same time, meaning that it gives you access to buffs for you and your allies. If it didn't have this feature, I probably would have put it in B tier, but because you can buff you and your allies with it and build it for utility, I think it bumps it up. And also, being the primary candidate for a subsumed ability on Dante, who already has an incredible kit, yeah, most people would still choose to keep Noctua in his skill set, even though it's arguably his least useful ability. It says a lot about how strong it is. Great damage, great crit, is lacking in the fire rate a bit, and honestly I can't really use this thing without arcane velocity, but I don't know if that's enough to bump it down to B tier because of all of the utility it has. I don't know, I keep thinking about it as I'm making this video, and I can't really see a world in which this would be stronger than Khora's Whipclaw. Either that means I need to bump Whipclaw up to A tier, but Noctua is better than both Dex Pixia and Hildryn's Balefire. I'm going to put it in B tier, but it's very close to A. Next up we have a weapon which on first glance you'd assume that it would be trash because it's a sniper, and this game never caters towards snipers. But Cyte 09's Exalted Sniper is kind of a cheat code within its category. It combines with his skill set to of course nuke enemies through rooms. I think this is one of the most versatile weapons on this list, and that goes for the modding. Of course for Cyte 09 you can mod him for a bunch of things, Arcane Crepuscular, you can throw on more augmented, but because the ult fire on his Exalted Sniper, you can build it for any arcanes that include cold damage. It freezes enemies with its ult fire, makes the headshots easier. It combines with your first ability to kill enemies through walls for massive amounts of crit and weak point damage. This also means it's better at dealing with Warframe's meta because you have those wall hacks and punch through. You don't have to be running from room to room doing massive amounts of damage with a melee weapon. If you can kill an enemy from across the map that then ricochets to other enemies, it's also pretty easy to build for, and inevitably arcanes have made this thing a bit of a beast even though it already was. I think compared to the S tier, it is lacking a little bit in speed and versatility, and that's purely based on the weapon type alone. Because of Cyte 09's kit, this sniper is doing a lot of what Ivara's Artemis bow wants to be doing, but better. For me, I'm putting it A tier. Next up we have Jade's Glory. Not much has changed, they are still incredibly good, and now they just have access to more damage. Of course the best way to use them is to tag a bunch of enemies with your first skill, thus giving you access to the ult fire that detonates enemies. It's a pretty good room nuke, it combines really well with her skills, although there are some enemy types she can struggle with. This weapon works incredibly well with both blast and gas. I do think its primary fire is a bit shit, but I never really use that anyway. This weapon is mainly made good by the way it combines with her other skills. No augments or helmet really needed, which is really nice. I don't think it's the strongest Exalted in the game, although it is very efficient. For me, I'm going to put it right where Khora is, in the B tier. It's very similar. And finally we have Temple's Exalted Guitar, Lizzie. Once again, a skill that is made even better by the kit that it comes with, but on its own it's still incredibly strong. Very good crit, status, can shred hordes of enemies very easily, but it is then bolstered by those crit boosts that Temple has, and not to mention all of that fire damage bonus you get from their third skill. I think what sends this one over the edge even further is the access to its ult fire. ADSing and sending out those arcoplasmal type of waves with each individual element you have available to you. These aren't just good for priming enemies because they have an incredibly fast fire rate, good damage, and you can spam them whilst holding down your main fire. So spraying enemies down with your flamethrower and then mashing 1, 2, 3, 4, there's nothing that's really going to survive that combo, especially when you throw in her other skills. Its overall DPS isn't going to be as fast as some of the broken ass melee weapons we have, and I think that's probably the only reason I wouldn't put it in S tier, but it's very close. Hordes of enemies will not survive this weapon. It is fast, it is efficient, and it can handle tougher targets at the same time. I could be a bit wrong on this one. This is extremely close to S tier, but I'm going to put it at the top of A, and that's mainly due to a lot of the S tier candidates being able to just one-shot hordes of enemies, where this weapon may take a little bit of ramp up by comparison. So our final tier list looks like this. We have Landslide, Shattered Lash, Peacemaker, Baruuk's Fists, Valkyr's Talons and Primal Fury in S tier, Lizzie, Bladestorm, Exalted Blade, Shadow Claws, and Cyte 9 Sniper, all sitting sturdy within A tier. B tier we have a very close to being A tier, Whipclaw and Glory, and even Noctua is also close to being in A. However, I feel confidently that Hildryn's Balefire and Dex Pixia should be in B. C tier is home to Artemis Bow, and then down in D tier we have the Diwata because it requires just way too much to make it good. That's my tier list. Let me know if you guys agree or disagree. If you start having an absolute tantrum in the comment section, I will just point and laugh at you because this is just purely opinion based. No problem having civil discussion with each other in the comments and suggesting builds and setups for everyone to try, of course. Appreciate you all for watching. See you guys in the next video.